Welcome everybody to Module 2. In this module, our objective is to demonstrate understanding of existing bilingual and dual language education models in the U.S. and the similarities and differences between the existing models. There are lots of models of bilingual and dual language education, and so there's lots of misunderstanding about the terms bilingual education and dual language education. So the goal in this module is to present you with some concepts to use in understanding key aspects and features of bilingual and dual language programs. So in terms of the models of bilingual and dual language education, what's common is that all of the models of bilingual and dual language education somehow involve more than one language or involve people who know more than one language. What varies are who participates in the programs, what are the purposes of the programs, and who controls or governs the program. So in terms of the kinds of things we need to consider in terms of those similarities and differences, we need to think about participants, purposes, and control. And these factors will affect what we're calling key attributes of programs. So the relationship of the participants to others in the program or the school. Are they segregated or integrated? The percentage of time learning in and or using each language in the instructional program. What is the linguistic goal? Is it additive or subtractive in terms of language? And finally, what are the teacher qualifications? We're going to break this down in a linear and completely analytical process. So the goal is that once we look at these variables and these key attributes, then we can work on seeing how these apply in terms of understanding various program models. So there's a handout on Canvas that I think would be helpful for you to have downloaded and ready to work through, maybe even printed out. It's based on Exhibit 2.1 on page 24 of the OELA report, which is required reading for this module, but it includes other information as well. We'll start out by examining the variables and the attributes of program models. So these are represented here in column 1. First, it's important to think about the participants. What are the language profiles of the pupils in the education programs? And specifically, what is the language background, the native language, or the L1 of the pupils? In the OELA report reading, we see that the student population served as ELL or non-ELL. In order to think more deeply in this course about power and language, we are encouraging you to think of the pupils' languages in terms of power. So is the language of the pupil the majoritized language in the society, which, for example, would be English in the United States, or is it a minoritized language? For example, in the United States, that could be Spanish or Navajo, Chinese, Haitian Creole, and so forth. Language minority students, or those who have had their language minoritized within a society, are more at risk of losing their language, as we saw in the examples in Module 1. Many pupils come to school already knowing 2 languages to varying degrees as well. Some of these pupils are simultaneous bilinguals, basically bilingual from birth due to the languages they're exposed to, or they might be sequential bilinguals. One language was spoken in the home and perhaps another in preschool or other contexts that the child entered after initial language acquisition. While few programs have been designed especially for these kinds of bilingual students, we find that they participate in various program models. Following participants, we need to consider the purposes of the education in terms of language. Is the purpose to learn the majoritized language? For example, to learn English? Is it to learn a minoritized language? For example, to learn Spanish, Navajo, Chinese, or Haitian Creole, for example? Or is the purpose to be bilingual, both the majoritized language and a minoritized language? It's important to remember, so in that case, it would be to learn English and one of the other languages, such as Spanish or Navajo, Chinese, Haitian Creole, or whatever. Please keep in mind, as you think of the examples, please keep all of this in mind as you think of the examples presented in the previous module. Finally, we need to consider who's in control of this education. Who's in charge? Who's the governing body? It's important to consider where the decision-making power comes from. Whose voices were heard in the creation of the program? Is this a representative government body, the local community, some other authority? And once we know who has control, we need to consider the influence of the language backgrounds of these bodies by asking these kinds of questions here. Does this body already know the majoritized language? Does this body already know the minoritized language? Is this body already bilingual? We also need to consider what is the relationship of this body to power. Is this a privileged body or an oppressed body? Now that we have examined the larger variables of participants, purpose, and control, we need to be able to think about a number of other attributes as well. Having a deep conceptual grasp of these will help you meet the learning objectives of this module because you'll be able to understand existing bilingual and dual language education models in the US, and you'll be able to demonstrate understanding of the similarities and differences between the existing models. So use the handout as we move forward. We're still focusing on the first column on the handout. So once we know who's participating in the program, we can ask about the relationship or position of the program participants. So are the participants segregated? So that would mean that all the participants in the program interact only with those who are the same in terms of language background. Or are the participants integrated? All the participants in the program interact with others who are different in terms of language background. The next attribute to consider is the percentage of instructional time spent in each language. So you might have 100% of the time in the majoritized language. For example, 100% of the time in English. 50 to 100% of the time in the minoritized language. For example, 100% in Spanish, Navajo, Chinese, Haitian Creole. 90-10, which means 90% in the minoritized language and 10% in the majoritized language. For example, 90% initial instruction in Spanish or some other minoritized language with 10% in English, transitioning to 50% time in each language. Or students might have 50-50, 50% in each language. For example, 50% time in Spanish or other minoritized language, and 50% in English. Despite the stated purposes of the program, what is the long-term impact on the language of the program participants? In additive program models, Participants add a new language to their linguistic repertoire while maintaining and developing their original language. In subtractive programs, participants lose a language because the original language is not maintained or developed. Remember, this is over the long term. The next key attribute to consider is the teacher's linguistic qualifications. Each program model requires that teachers are either bilingual or monolingual. As we've seen, several models require some combination of teacher qualifications. And there are some models that require specialized language teaching, training, or licensure. So you might have a teacher who is bilingual and biliterate, or you might have a teacher who is monolingual and literate. Or your program model overall might have some teachers who are bilingual and biliterate and other teachers who are monolingual and literate. So now we will begin to analyze program models in terms of these variables and key attributes. In your handout, you will see that we are including programs that are not bilingual or dual language programs. These programs are important for you to know about because the programs might use terms like immersion or bilingual that are associated with bilingual or dual language education. It's important to clarify why these are not truly bilingual or dual language programs. So we'll be looking at English only, sometimes known as immersion or submersion programs. We will be looking at sheltered English immersion, and we will be looking at transitional bilingual education programs. So again, going back to your handout, we'll be looking at this column, and this column. So in the first column, in this section of your handout, we'll be looking at English-only immersion, or what is often called submersion. In this approach, we see that speakers of minoritized languages are given instruction solely in English. This can happen in the mainstream, in which case speakers of various minoritized languages are integrated with majority language with majority language speakers. Or it can happen like it did in the Bureau of Indian Affairs boarding schools, in which all the Native American children from various language backgrounds were all immersed in the majority language. So the participants are speakers of any minoritized language. The purpose is to provide instruction in English. They're governed by the government, or they could be private or parochial. All students are integrated into the so-called mainstream. They can sometimes be segregated, as we just noted. In terms of language percentage, it's 100% of the time in the majority language. Impact on language is subtractive. And teachers' qualifications are that they be monolingual English speakers. So now the second column on your handout. It's really important in the Massachusetts context to understand sheltered English immersion, or SEI. Due to the 2002 passage of the referendum known as Question 2, SEI was established as the dominant approved model of educating pupils of minoritized language groups in the state. In November 2017, as you know, or as you'll be hearing more about, I should say, in the next module, a new law was passed called the Look Bill, which allows districts more flexibility in terms of program and model designs. However, in sheltered English immersion, or SEI, we have participants who are speakers of any minoritized language who are classified as English language learners. The purpose is to learn English by being taught all subjects in English. This is, of course, governed by the government. And the relationships among students depends on the districts. So, and sometimes this is impacted by if there's a high incidence of minoritized language groups, or if there's a low incidence, or if there's a lot of diversity in the language groups. So students in this program might be integrated into mainstream classrooms, or they might be segregated by language group. So, as I said, that depends on the district. 100% of the time is spent in English, no instruction in the native languages. The impact long-term on students' languages is subtractive in nature. Teacher qualifications are that they're monolingual, English speakers, and of course they're literate, and they must be SEI endorsed. In the next column in your handout, we see transitional bilingual education, or TBE. And as you'll hear more about, this was the legally mandated so-called bilingual education model in Massachusetts from the 1970s until a referendum known as Question 2, which was passed in 2002, which established SEI as the dominant approved model. It's still a model in some areas of the country. And note that although there is the term bilingual in its name, this type of model is no longer considered a dual language model because it is subtractive in nature. So who participates? Speakers of any minoritized language. The purpose is for these students to learn content in their home language, so math, science, social studies, while they transition to instruction in English. Again, this is public education controlled by the government. Students are segregated by minoritized language group. So that, for example, you might have all Portuguese speakers in the same classroom so that they're learning basic concepts in math and Portuguese while they're acquiring English. So the goal would be not to have reading and writing in Portuguese over the long term, but to have reading and writing in English over the long term. But TBE allows the students not to fall behind in their content area learning while they're acquiring English. Language percentages can vary a lot in a program like this. The transition from most instruction in the minority language to ultimately 100% in the majoritized language in the mainstream. So the difficulty here with TBE is it's not always the case that children come to school or come to this country in kindergarten and then proceed to first grade, second grade, and so forth. Kids can come in any grade, right? So in the early years that a student attends a program, they need the majority of the instruction in the minoritized language. And then it changes over time so that they can do more in English. So if you have a group of students who come in kindergarten, they have most of their instruction in the minoritized language in kindergarten, a little bit less in first grade, a little bit less in second grade, as they increasingly have more instruction in English. However, if you have a kiddo that arrives in third grade, of course, they will need most of their instruction in the minoritized language if they are new arrivals. So the language percentages can be pretty tricky in TBE programs. The long-term impact on language is subtractive, right? Because the minoritized language is really just used transitionally. It's not designed to be maintained or developed. TBE teachers must be bilingual. In some cases, they have to be bilingual and with also ESL certification, or sometimes they can be paired with an ESL teacher and English as a second language teacher. Or sometimes they can have a partner teacher who is a monolingual English-speaking teacher. There's some variety in this model across the states. So now we will move on to look at what the OELA report identifies as one-way dual language programs. So developmental bilingual education or maintenance bilingual programs, one-way immersion or modern language immersion, and heritage native language programs. So on your handout, we will be looking at these columns. So first we'll look at developmental bilingual education. This model developed out of transitional bilingual education and similar in terms of participants. However, the purpose of the program is to learn content in the minoritized language and increasingly more instruction in the majoritized language while maintaining and developing the minoritized language. In terms, so again, governed by the government, and the relationship is, again, that students are segregated by minoritized language group, but then they're integrated to varying degrees into the mainstream. And in terms of percentages, transition from most instruction in the minoritized language to most instruction in the majoritized language in the mainstream. But even after students are transitioned into the so-called mainstream, they maintain at least one course in the minoritized language. So say, for example, you're talking about a Spanish-English developmental bilingual education program. Students might have most of their instruction in Spanish with gradually more in English, and they transition into the mainstream in English where they're integrated with native English speakers, but they still keep taking at least one course that is taught in Spanish. So it could be a Spanish language arts course, or it could be, for example, social studies taught via Spanish language. The impact on language is that it's additive. So since students have the continuing support and development of the minoritized language, they're able to maintain it and they do not lose it. So students start with one language and they add another language and they don't lose language at all. Teacher qualifications, again, we have bilingual teachers with ESL support and then eventually monolingual English mainstream teachers. One-way immersion or modern language immersion is often known as the Canadian immersion model. In this model, we have speakers of the majoritized language who are immersed in a minoritized language or a modern foreign language, right? So this allows children who already speak the majoritized language to learn another language. So these are government schools, charter schools sometimes, and these students are generally segregated. They start together. They're all in the same language group, speakers of the majority language. Most of the instruction occurs in the minoritized language with some instruction in the majoritized language. The impact is that it's additive. These are students who will be learning an additional language. And teachers are bilingual, but mostly with native-like skills in the minoritized language. So getting back to the language percentages, I just wanted to note that while most of the instruction is in the minoritized language, the percentage of time that's spent teaching in the majoritized language can vary a little bit from program to program. So let me just show you some examples that we have in Massachusetts. We have the Pioneer Valley Chinese Immersion Charter School. We have the French Immersion School in Milton, or program in Milton, Mass, as well as French Immersion in Holliston, Massachusetts. So again, these are native English-speaking children who are immersed in these minoritized languages. Heritage language programs are for pupils who know the majoritized language, but whose family's heritage language is or was a minoritized language. The purpose is to provide instruction in a minoritized language for the purpose of language reclamation and cultural regeneration. These programs can be run by the public schools, or they might be run by Native American tribes or some other entity. These students are generally segregated. They're all from the same language and cultural heritage group, so they're not integrated for this kind of program. It is a separate program. In terms of language percentage, most of the instruction occurs in the minoritized language, with some instruction in the majoritized language. Again, that's going to vary program by program. And these programs are additive in that the majority language is not at risk. Pupils develop both languages. And teachers in these programs are bilingual and biliterate, where the heritage language is a language that's written down. So some examples of these one-way heritage language programs would include the Wampanoag Language Reclamation Project, Navajo Immersion School, Cherokee Immersion School, and the Kodiak Alutiiq Immersion Language Nest. Finally, we have two-way dual language programs. These are known as two-way immersion or dual language immersion programs. So now we're looking at the final column in our handout. In two-way immersion programs, we have participants of two language groups. So half of the participants would be speakers of the majoritized language, and 50% would be speakers of the minoritized language. This is ideal, right? Ideally, these programs seek 50% participants from each group. However, as the report says, that at least 30% must be from the minoritized language group. In many two-way programs, we find that in fact more and more of the students are from the minoritized language backgrounds. They've already achieved some degree of bilingualism, so they are not monolingual in the strictest terms, in terms of monolingual in the minoritized language. So the purpose of these programs, and this is the sort of the focus of our course and these modules, is for both groups to become bilingual and biliterate. And these can be governed by the general public education body, the charter schools, or they could be private, they could be parochial. Ideally, participants are integrated most of the time in these programs, and we'll talk about some exceptions in just a moment, but that's the ideal of the model. Language percentages could be 90-10 or 50-50, and there's some variation on each of those models too. So as I mentioned earlier when we were talking about the variables in the first column, in terms of the 90-10, this means that 90% of the instruction is in the minoritized language and 10 is in the majoritized language. And that generally, that's what the percentage is at the beginning of the program. And then it changes over time in general from 90-10 to 80-20, 70-30, something like that. So gradually, students achieve a 50-50 percentage in each language. In some places, that's been called the West Coast model of two-way immersion. The 50-50 model actually starts out with 50% of the time in each language. So there isn't that sort of emphasis on the minoritized language that we see in the 90-10 models. 50-50 models are a little bit more common in East Coast programs. The impact on language for all the participants is additive. The students in the program get to maintain the home language and add another language. Teachers are bilingual and biliterate, or bilingual and biliterate paired with a monolingual teacher in the majoritized language. So here in Massachusetts, there are many models, many examples of two-way immersion schools. If you don't see yours here, let us know. We'll be happy to add you. So there are some additional considerations for two-way immersion programs. So required features are at least 50% of the instruction takes place in the partner language or the minoritized language. And students of different language backgrounds are integrated at least 60% of the time. So it's important to note that for full immersion programs, which is the 90-10 model, both groups of students receive initial literacy instruction in the minoritized language first. So 90% in minoritized language and 10% at the majority at the start. And then it shifts to 50% in each language by third grade. Partial immersion is the 50-50 model, where you have 50% of the time spent in each language from the start. Another consideration for two-way immersion programs involves the initial language of literacy instruction. So this issue has caused the development of two modified versions of two-way instruction. In each two-way immersion model, a modified version notes that each group acquires initial literacy in the home language. So this results in segregated language instruction for part of the time. And so, of course, this will affect the overall percentages of time that students spend in each language. When we think about the language allocation models, we can have a model in which one teacher instructs in two languages, and that teacher must be highly bilingual and biliterate, and would need to be able to prepare curriculum in each language. The other model is to have two teachers in which each teacher teaches in one language only. This is sometimes called the side-by-side model. And for this model to work, much more obviously collaboration is needed. And then each teacher is responsible for two groups of students. Sometimes one bilingual teacher is paired with one monolingual teacher. And so this also has some implications for parent communication as well, right? Unless both teachers are bilingual, usually the bilingual teacher is the one who is communicating with the parents of the children of the minoritized language, and then the monolingual teacher is the one who communicates with the parents of the majoritized language. So it's something to consider. There are definite implications there. So which model is best? So it's really hard to measure results and compare. Most of the research on bilingual education on these models is not based on randomized experiments or rigorous quasi-experiments. They tend to focus on short-term rather than long-term outcomes. And across models, across states, bilingual instruction is implemented very differently. So sometimes we're not really comparing apples to apples, we're comparing apples to oranges, right? So-called bilingual instruction is implemented differently in different studies, so it's really hard to synthesize the results. So what do we know? According to Valentino and Reardon's study in 2015, where they looked at the effectiveness of 4 instructional programs, they found that for Latino students in particular, 2 language programs led to better academic outcomes than English immersion programs in the long term. These results are consistent with previous research. One of the weaknesses, though, of this study was that the program effectiveness is measured by tests administered in English. Assessment of literacy and learning in the minoritized language would help determine the effectiveness of two-way immersion programs. So in terms of comparing models, there are no easy answers, and we have other questions too. Comparing models brings us to key issues with research in general. So it depends on what you measure, why you measure, how, and when. So some questions include, do standardized tests measure everything that's important to the program's purpose? How do we measure principles of teaching for social justice, like working with and not against individuals, families, and communities? And what are the advantages and disadvantages of measuring short-term versus long-term learning? So for this, you really need to think about the articulated goals of your school and your community. I mentioned that second bullet question there because here at Boston College, we believe that teaching for social justice is important. So we need to think about how do we measure outcomes related to social justice. So please take a moment to reflect upon the learning objective for this module and think about your understanding of existing bilingual and dual language education models in the US and the key similarities and differences between and among existing models. This concludes Module 2. Please take the quiz on Canvas. Note that this assignment must be completed alone. Thank you.